Hey there, folks, and welcome to episode 2 of Big Stick Radio. I hope everyone enjoyed our inaugural episode last week, in which we discussed 7 flashpoints to keep an eye on going forward into 2024. Be sure to check that one out on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts if you haven't already. For this week's episode, we're going to take a close look at the recent U.S. attacks in Yemen that came in retaliation to the ongoing Houthi attacks on global shipping in the Red Sea. Quick aside, technically the Houthi organization is called Ansar Allah, but the U.S. government and the media at large refer to them as the Houthis, so I'm going to do the same. Just to recap, the Houthis are an Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen, which has been making headlines since October when they began attacking ships transiting the Red Sea. You might be asking yourself, okay, why do I care if a bunch of terrorist pirates are messing with ships thousands of miles away? The thing is that while Yemen is a pretty desolate country, it's located strategically adjacent to what is called the Bab al-Mandeb, a narrow strait between Yemen and Djibouti, which allows ships to enter into the Red Sea and travel up through Egypt's Suez Canal. More than 6 million barrels of oil pass through the Bab el-Mandeb each day, making it one of the most important energy conduits in the world. The results of these attacks could, of course, have second and third order effects on the oil market, international shipping, and more. According to the White House, there have been 27 attacks on commercial shipping affecting more than 50 nations. As a result, more than 2,000 ships have been forced to divert thousands of miles around Africa. This, of course, takes time and money, both of which will cause an increase in costs for everyday consumers. After 3 months of these attacks, the US and UK responded with a number of strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen on Thursday, January 11th. These targets apparently included drone storage facilities, missile facilities, and others. The US followed up these strikes with another attack on Tuesday, January 16th, which specifically targeted Houthi missile sites. According to Reuters, the strike came a day after Houthi forces hit a US-owned and operated ship with a ballistic missile. Unlike last week's strike, the latest one went after targets as they were detected. President Biden issued the following statement following the first strike, saying, "These targeted strikes are a clear message that the United States and our partners will not tolerate attacks on our personnel or allow hostile actors to imperil freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical commercial routes. I will not hesitate to direct further measures to protect our people and the free flow of international commerce as necessary." And just so you all are aware, I recently did receive news that these strikes have been ongoing, so by the time you're listening to this, there may have been more than the 2 I previously mentioned. I'll also be sure to link the entire statement in the description if you'd like to check it out. So here's my main takeaway. This is too little, too late. Keep in mind the Houthi attacks have been going on for more than 3 months. These attacks include everything from drones to ballistic missiles. They've been so bad that most ships are choosing to reroute around the entire continent of Africa than risk passing through the Red Sea on their way to Europe and the broader Western Hemisphere. This is an incredible feat. Using off-the-shelf drones, which you can literally buy on the internet, by the way, this rebel group has been able to turn the clock back more than 150 years to a time before the Suez Canal even existed. That's pretty incredible, but it's also a threat to the well-being of the global community. It's absolutely wild to me that a ragtag group of terrorists playing pirate pulled this off. I mean, what a return on investment, right? It's also interesting to note that the Houthis apparently have all this money to destabilize global shipping, while Yemenis are dying from starvation and diseases like cholera. Really speaks to their priorities. Getting back to the point, though, a few defensive strikes aren't going to cut it. In fact, there were reports of more Houthi attacks on shipping just hours after the American-UK-led strikes. Just think about this proportionally speaking. You have the Houthis, backed by Iran, disrupting global shipping, which is the very lifeblood of the world economy. In response, the US and UK attack a few targets in a war-torn country most people can't point to on a map. This isn't exactly sending a clear signal that this behavior won't be tolerated, and it clearly hasn't been enough to change or prevent that behavior in the first place. The problem here is that American leaders and the West in general lost the plot on this situation a long time ago. There's not a lot of things that most of the world agrees upon, but deterring piracy is definitely one of them. You can actually go back to the Roman Empire for examples on how counter-piracy has always been a priority for world powers. In fact, one of the first global actions by the nascent United States in the early 1800s was a counter-piracy operation against the Barbary states in North Africa. Now, there's two things that have cemented US power in the post-Cold War world. One is the dominance of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and the other is the responsibility for the US Navy to keep freedom of the seas for global trade. The US agreement with the global community on the latter goes something like this. Hey, look, we're the big dog in town. Let us run the show as we see fit, and in exchange, we will make sure your ships aren't attacked by pirates and that sea lanes remain open. It's a pretty good deal when it works, but keeping the US end of the bargain requires vigilance. The US Navy is far and away the best in the world, but even they can't be everywhere all at once. So how do you prevent pirates and other ne'er-do-wells from disrupting global trade? You use deterrence. I went into further detail on how deterrence works in a blog post that I will link in the description, but for our purposes, I define it this way. Deterrence is the practice of dissuading adverse action with the threat of retaliation. There are two primary rules to effective deterrence. One, your opponent, in this case the Houthis, needs to believe that you will respond with the necessary force should they threaten your interests. Second, you must be willing to protect your interest swiftly and decisively when the time comes. Failure to follow these rules not only leads to failure of deterrence, but also makes it harder to deter your adversary later on. Deterrence is basically a glass cannon. It's a powerful and intimidating tool, but incredibly delicate and almost impossible to put back together when broken. So are the Houthis and their Iranian backers deterred? No way. They've budgeted for this very scenario. There's no terrorist group or bad actor out there who hasn't figured out the US strategy at this point. They know retaliation will come in one form or another, and they simply bake it into the equation. There's actually a great scene in The West Wing where President Bartlett, played by Martin Sheen, blasts his national security advisors for providing him lackluster targets following an attack on an American aircraft. He notes that the enemy has already factored in those targets in their decision-making, that it's, quote, the cost of doing business. When asked what they should do instead, Bartlett responds by directing his team to, quote, put together a response scenario that doesn't make me think we are just docking somebody's damn allowance. This is exactly what the Houthis have done in regard to the recent US-UK strikes. They accounted for a response from the Americans and have continued business as usual. We find ourselves in this situation because the US broke deterrence rule number 2 by failing to respond swiftly and decisively to the initial threats to global shipping. So why the delay? It's not like it took 3 months for US assets to arrive in theater. Well, my speculation is that the White House wanted to avoid further escalation in the region. The irony, of course, is that avoiding escalation often invites further aggression. This is particularly the case in the Middle East. There's also the Iran question, which I'm sure they'd like to avoid. The Houthis made themselves one of Iran's most prized proxy groups in a very short time, and going too hard on them could upset their Iranian benefactors. Early on, the Biden administration sought to reinitialize the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which President Trump removed the US from during his term. Those efforts have floundered for years, and the deal as a whole is basically on life support at this point. The administration has basically given up on the idea in the short term. But given that many members of the Biden administration helped put the original nuclear deal together, they likely want to keep the door open for future negotiations. Ultimately, I think that would be wishful thinking, but there's a weird obsession amongst many in the DC foreign policy crowd to bring Iran back into the international community, so who knows? Speaking of Iran, just what the hell is going on with the mullahs? In the span of 24 hours on Wednesday, January 17th, Iran decided to go ballistic on pretty much the entire Middle East, conducting strikes in Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. Not only that, these mad lads even took responsibility for the whole thing, bragging about it on their state media. The Iranians claimed the strike in Iraq was against an alleged Israeli spy site in the country's Kurdistan region. Take that with a grain of salt, though, considering the paranoid Iranian government sees Mossad behind every rock. The attack in Syria reportedly targeted ISIS leaders who were allegedly behind an attack in the Iranian city of Kerman, which left 95 people dead. The Pakistan strike took place in Balochistan and killed 2 kids and injured a few others. Iran claimed the attack was targeting an Iranian militant group called Jaish al-Adl. Forgive me if I'm butchering that name, by the way, which it claimed is operating within Pakistan borders. Okay, so let's break this down really quickly. The Iraq attack is pretty wild considering Iran has more or less made Iraq a puppet state in the past 10 years or so. When ISIS steamrolled the Iraqi military, Iran was more than happy to send in their Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps folks to clean up the mess and further entrench Iranian support amongst Iraq's majority Shia Muslim population. This is actually when the now deceased Qasem Soleimani, former head of the IRGC's Quds Force, became a sort of folk hero before the Trump administration turned him into salsa. I've actually got a write-up on Qasem Soleimani on my Substack, so be sure to check that out. While ISIS is mostly gone, Iran and their proxy militias certainly are not, so it's pretty bizarre that they would be so brazen as to attack their own ally. That is, until you look at where they attacked. Kurdistan is a semi-autonomous region in northern Iraq, which borders the Iranian border. There's actually a lot of Kurds living on the Iranian side, and that's always made Iran feel a little uncomfortable given the popularity of the Kurdish independence movement in the region. I'm not sure if that had anything to do with the targeting of the strike, but it wouldn't surprise me. The attack in Syria, however, isn't exactly surprising. That bombing in Kerman was particularly nasty, and there's no way the Iranians were going to let ISIS think they can threaten the Iranian homeland. Strategically speaking, they had to respond. So there you go. But this Pakistan attack, holy crap. I'm pretty hawkish against Iran, and I don't think very highly of the government, but wow, even I didn't think they'd do something this wild. Keep in mind that Pakistan, while it has its flaws, is a nuclear-armed power. Not only that, but if anyone were to pop off a nuke to defend itself, Pakistan would certainly be on my short list. My take here is that this attack specifically was an emotional response on the part of Iran. The attack in Kerman was the deadliest they've seen since the Islamic Revolution in the late 70s, and it targeted a ceremony honoring the life of Qasem Soleimani. Keep in mind, Soleimani is now basically the highest-ranking martyr to the cause of the Islamic Revolution, so the attack must have felt personal to the supreme leader and his band of zealots. Pakistan immediately condemned the Iranian attack and responded with a strike of its own on Thursday, codenamed Operation Marg Bar Sarmachar. Forgive me if I butchered that one as well, but it roughly translates to death to insurgents. The attack allegedly targeted hideouts of Sarmachars in Iran's Sistan-Baluchistan province. Per the Pakistani Foreign Ministry, this action is a manifestation of Pakistan's unflinching resolve to protect and defend its national security against all threats. These Sarmachars were apparently members of the Balochistan Liberation Army, which is an ethno-nationalist movement based mostly in Afghanistan. They've claimed a series of suicide bombings in Pakistan since 2000, and they're a designated foreign terrorist organization in the US, UK, and Pakistan itself. It would appear that Pakistani officials are using the Sarmachar argument as an excuse to conduct the strikes within Iran. My guess is based on the Pakistani statement that they wanted to save face without dramatically escalating tensions. It's a sort of bizarre decision, though, considering the BLA wasn't involved in the Iranian attack on Pakistan. Maybe Pakistan just wanted to show that they could conduct strikes within Iran. I'm not entirely sure, but there's definitely more than meets the eye here. I actually wouldn't be surprised if Pakistan recognized the initial Iranian attack was clearly an emotive response. I can actually imagine some Pakistani diplomat sitting down this morning with his Iranian counterpart over tea after they retaliated, saying, "Hey man, look, we get that you're super pissed off, but we can't let that shit fly. We're gonna need to attack something in your country, so just be aware." That, or Iran and Pakistan just go into a full blown proxy war. Hopefully not, though, because that's a neighborhood where folks are a bit more loosey goosey on the whole nuclear question. To give y'all a sense of how wild this situation is, even the frickin' Taliban in Afghanistan are asking both sides to calm down. China also issued a statement with similar sentiments. I can imagine neither want two of the largest powers in their neighborhood escalating to the brink of nuclear war. So, for the final part of the show, I wanted to try something new and add an historical anecdote that some of you might find interesting. As I'm recording this episode, we've reached the 105th anniversary of the start of the Paris Peace Conference, which ultimately dictated what would become the Versailles Treaty that formally ended World War I. Versailles to me is a cautionary tale in international relations, specifically when it comes to long-term strategic thinking, the importance of having grace in victory, and treating your vanquished adversary with dignity. Now, World War I was undoubtedly one of the bloodiest and unnecessary conflicts in human history. It was the result of what happens when proud men sleepwalk even prouder empires into foolish wars through entangling alliances. Approximately 40 million people died as a result of a war whose battle lines often shifted less than a few hundred yards. It was a wholly unnecessary conflict that you'd think would have taught the world a lesson. Unfortunately, it did not. Instead, the Entente powers, keen on taking advantage of the situation, sought to make an example of the German Empire. By excluding Germany and the rest of the Central Powers from the conference, the Big Four allies set the stage for what would ultimately be a ruinous decision for everyone. The treaty levied disastrous penalties on Germany, including the surrender of 10% of its pre-war territory, all of its overseas possessions, the surrender of the port of Danzig, and of course the notorious reparations, which tanked the German economy for years to come. But perhaps worst of all was the inclusion of a provision which required the German Empire to take full responsibility for the war. This final humiliation came at the insistence of Woodrow Wilson, despite the fact that all sides bore some responsibility for the conflict. The result of all these punitive measures led to humiliation and economic disaster for the German people. It allowed the Nazi Party to ride into power with promises to overturn Versailles and set the stage for what would eventually become World War II, a conflict that was somehow even more disastrous than its predecessor. As British Prime Minister David Lloyd George prophesied shortly after the treaty's signing, we shall have to fight another war again in 25 years' time. Well, folks, that's all I've got for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to share it with a friend. If you haven't already, subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. If reading is more your style, be sure to check out my Substack at thebigstick.substack.com. And of course, follow us on socials at The Big Stick. Thanks again, and have a bully day.